Second hour is here, and we are live from Fastport Studios. It's time for some Tech Talk. Take it away there, Jimmy.
The Braz is here, and by the way, it's the
Braz.
longest running segment of all of Radio Nemo. Over 20 years of making the miracle happen, rapidly approaching 1,000 episodes, 1,000 editions. Robert Braswell, the executive director of the ATA's Technology and Maintenance Council, is joining us for another Tech Talk. And by the way, few people have embraced or taken to this new format more than Robert Braswell has. He gets it, dude. He gets it. He totally gets it, man. He is here, and we are thrilled to have him. Good morning to you, Robert. Welcome back as always.
Well, thank you, Jimmy Mack, for that very warm introduction. It is always great to be back here with you guys for Tech Talk with TMC. And this week we welcome to the program Alan Schaeffer, who is the executive director for the Engine Technology Forum. Alan is an industry expert with many years of experience on government and technical matters dealing with diesel technology and other engine technologies. And we're very pleased he could join us once again to talk about, this time, the future of diesel. But before we get started, as you know, every week we like to make a special offer available to our listeners. And this week it's our TMC Fuel Economy Digest. We're offering it for the special price of just $25 plus shipping and handling. It is a compendium of just about everything you can think of when it comes to commercial vehicle fuel economy testing, speccing, and maintenance. And you can get it by calling our customer service line toll-free at 1-866-821-3468. Just mention radionemo.com, but you can get it for that special price. Also, if you're an owner-operator or a small fleet, you got 100 or fewer power units, we would love you to join TMC for the discounted annual dues of just $150. Do that today. You'll get our 2-volume recommended practices manual. That's over 4,000 pages of information on the care and feeding of your commercial vehicle and many other good benefits too. So please call that same toll-free number if you're interested in signing up. And as always, we remind our listeners up front that any TMC recommended practices we might discuss reflect the consensus of our members. We offer them as recommendations only, and everyone must first determine for themselves if they are safe and appropriate for their operation. Please remember that TMC doesn't endorse any product, person, or service. Any opinions expressed of the show are those of the individual and not necessarily the opinion of his or her company, nor of TMC unless stated otherwise. And with all that out of the way, please welcome to the program this morning, Alan Schaeffer. Good morning, Alan.
Good morning, Robert. Great to be with you.
Great to have you back here. So, we're talking today about the future of diesel. And, just before we get into what's going on in North America, what can we kind of expect over the next several years when it comes to the future of diesel power plants, I was thinking maybe we could just step back a little bit and see, are there trends globally that will be influencing the future of diesel here in North America? I mean, just for example, if you look at cars, in Europe, still 50% of the cars that are manufactured new are diesel power plants. That's kind of unique, isn't it, in the world where, there are a lot of diesel applications and non-commercial applications in the European marketplace. You don't see that here in the States.
Well, that's right. We have a global economy and a global vehicle and engine and fuel market, and diesel is really squarely positioned across the globe as really a technology that's just dominant in many places. So you certainly have that as a working factor. But there are trends, sort of pushing on that trend. And the first, I guess, of those really is what's happening in Europe. And certainly Europe is pushing harder towards electrification of their transportation segment in the light-duty space. And they have found themselves at a critical juncture that is in some ways pulling back a little bit from those bolder aspirations to stop selling cars powered by internal combustion engines, be it gas or diesel, by 2030. Some of that is being reset now a little bit. More flexibility is being provided for manufacturers. And I think just generally, the feeling in Europe was that there was too quick of a move to get rid of the internal combustion engine by a date certain, and that there was some greater and growing interest about the use of e-fuels, some of these new fuels that have zero carbon emissions and could allow the continued use of internal combustion engines with simply a fuel switch. And that would address a lot of the greenhouse gas reductions that Europe was hoping to achieve. So I guess we'll see on how that plays out. But certainly the standing of internal combustion around the globe and diesel in particular is still very strong. And even just this week, Mercedes and Audi both announced that they are extending their combustion vehicle commitments further than they had anticipated. And that means well beyond 2030. So we're talking another 10 plus years of, yes, we're going to keep producing and developing internal combustion engines. So I think, what's happening in the U.S. and Europe is the kind of thing where we're just realizing that some of those earlier ambitions of a few years ago just are not going to pan out for many different reasons in different places. So it's important to have technology available that works, is proven, and can get the job done each and every day.
And, it's worth noting that, and let's just take a step back one more time before we get into some of the specifics about the North American market and what the trends are going forward. Look at how far we've come just in the last 30 years, 40 years, when it comes to NOx emissions, particulate emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, diesels are nothing like their former selves. It's not your grandfather's diesel engine, so to speak.
Boy, isn't that the case? And I, started working in this industry back in the late 80s when a lot of these rules started to come into play. And we spent a lot of time talking about smoke emissions and roadside smoke testing and things like that. And it's so funny to look back on that now, because we have engines today that are truly near zero in particulate emissions, and a smoke test would be the furthest thing from your mind. So we have come a very long way. And I think that, there's a real testament to the continuous improvement of the technology, and, the fact that the industry is very comfortable with how it works and knows what to expect. And particularly now, there is, I think, a concern about how to manage risk from some of these emerging new pressures, new considerations and policy and other things. And I think that's going to keep people focused on diesel and other internal combustion engines for much longer.
And especially with some of the changes in the political climate, I think the industry has gotten some good news when it comes to the future of diesel, particularly with respect to some of the things that were happening in California that were really driving the whole mandate for electric vehicle adoption. And we're not trying to slam EVs. There are applications for electric vehicles that make sense. But if you look at long-haul trucking, that's not always the best place to start, I would think, right?
Absolutely. And we are definitely in, a period of a reality check and a reset, I think is a good word here, of some of these past policies that were pushing so aggressively for change to achieve greenhouse gas reduction goals, and really focus on that and essentially nothing else. And whether or not the technologies and policy that people were putting together were going to work was, really an afterthought. And so that's why we find ourselves, where we are today, where the California Advanced Clean Fleet Rule has been taken back. It was never going to be a workable rule in the time frames that ARB had hoped. And as they announced their rules, the mandate for manufacturers to produce zero-emission trucks and the mandate for fleets to buy them really were an interlocked policy that, for one to succeed, the other had to be succeeding. And now we find ourselves in a situation where one is no longer in effect, and the EPA and the Trump administration have sought to eliminate the other. So it is kind of a confusing time in the fleet business, and I don't envy fleet managers trying to think about purchases 3 and 5 years out where you want to be, because there is so much uncertainty, and that is really the order of the day, and I think we're going to be living with that for a while.
So we're talking about the Advanced Clean Fleets Rule, where fleets were going to be required to buy so many electric vehicles per year. That kind of got put off to the side. With no mandate for fleets to buy the electric vehicles, the manufacturers and dealers were still faced with the prospect of having to comply with the Advanced Clean Truck Rule, which said you had to sell these things. and a lot of these dealers were not able to sell diesel-powered vehicles because you have to sell so many EVs to sell diesels. And even in some states, I think maybe it was Oregon, where they basically had to say you can't sell diesels in the state anymore based on what the rule was looking like at the time. This was a few months ago. That's kind of leveled out a little bit because of this whole waiver issue. Maybe explain a little bit about what the waiver means and why California is a different duck when it comes to these kind of regulations.
Yeah, well, this goes way back, right? Before California was really in the leading space in terms of air quality regulation, even before the Clean Air Act was enacted in 1970. And so when it was enacted, Congress, saw that California had been working on its air quality problems independently and decided to recognize those very unique circumstances that California has as the coastal state, obviously with some very unique geography and climatic conditions there that really made it a challenge to reduce emissions, and felt like they needed to, have something different. So Congress granted them that authority to say, you can do your own thing there. We're going to issue you a waiver because of the shift between some of the policies at the federal level. But by and large, it is something that's been in place for a long time and has been, and that was in place for, I guess, I'm going to say about 15 or 20 years before the idea that other states could sort of sign on to California really started to take hold. So we had not just California being California, but we saw other states, particularly in the Northeast, begin to want to sign on to California's initially their clean car rules because they wanted more tools in the toolbox to achieve their air quality goals with regards to ozone emissions in the Northeast, and felt like having cleaner cars from California there was better than the federal option. And so that got going pretty heavily. So we have 17 states that are now in that bucket of cars that you buy, for example, in the state I live in Maryland, are certified to California emission standards. So, and then we have the truck rule really just came along more recently. So you have 10 states that are sort of following along California's truck rules for the same kind of reasons. So I think Congress probably never intended for things to get out of hand, so to speak, that one state could drive so much in national policy, particularly for industries that are nationally based, like trucking, which is by its very nature crossing state lines each and every day to deliver the commerce that this economy demands. And so that is really one of the fundamental questions about these legal challenges that have now emerged on the waivers, and that is whether or not those authorities are sustainable, and the way that the administration has chosen to challenge those is through the Congressional Review Act. And so there's much concern about whether or not that is going to hold up in the courts, and obviously we're going to have to wait a while for the litigation to play out on that. But it is, I think, an important time because and the trucking industry is really the great example of this, that one state's ideas and demands for achieving certain level of policy, and whether it be clean air or greenhouse gas emission reduction, was great for them, but for everyone else, it became much more complicated, and particularly when you get into the ability to sell technology and the situation that you described at the outset, Robert, where one state, Oregon, and I think Massachusetts was in this same boat, that you couldn't sell somebody a new diesel truck because you hadn't sold the proper quantity of electric vehicles. And here we are with a situation where somebody might have had a 15-year-old truck that had, 6 times the NOx emissions, and finally had scraped up enough money to buy a new truck. And they go in to do that and said, "Oh, sorry, we can't do it." And that's not what we should be doing, I think, and everybody realizes that we really should be encouraging investment in whatever technology works for you. And so I think it's been a tangled web. More recently, with California driving the nation in some of their policies, and they I think are experiencing, a bit of a reset on that, and we'll see how it works out. But I think it's the Trump administration has a very clear vision that we need to restore a national mandate, national control to some of these environmental policies. And not saying that California wouldn't have some of their own abilities, but whether or not we can have everybody sort of jump on that bandwagon, I think is going to be a bigger question.
Yeah, what applies to the South Coast Air Quality District certainly doesn't necessarily apply to the rest of the country, but I think there's like 13, 14 states that do follow what California is doing with respect to these emissions rules. And what's confusing is they don't all follow them equally. It seems like these states can take the cafeteria approach, right? Oh, we'll take this
Right.
part of the CARB rule, but not that part. Or we'll have our deadline for adoption will be different than their deadline for adoption. And if you're a national fleet or even a regional fleet, this has got to drive you crazy in trying to keep up with compliance.
I don't know how folks are doing it. I know there is a cottage industry that's developed to help navigate people through it, and that's probably a good thing because of the complexities, many that you've pointed out. And of course, all this is taking place with the backdrop of an economy that's sort of teetering back and forth with the freight demand. It's still somewhat suppressed. And just the continued acquisition of newer trucks and the turnover of the fleet is longer than it has been. So, there's clearly an appetite, I think, for investing in new technology, and not just for the emissions piece of it, but certainly there's huge advantages of some of these newer trucks from a safety perspective, from just many driver features and sort of the technology like we've come to, expect and use in our personal cars. A lot of that is now available in some of the newer generation trucks, and everyone should have the benefit of those advanced safety features for sure. So I think we would be in good place to have as many people as possible be able to get new trucks on the road as fast as possible, and that will help reduce emissions all the way around, save fuel, et cetera.
You're listening to Tech Talk with TMC. We have Alan Schaeffer here from the Engine Technology Forum. Alan, let's talk a little bit about the fuels. You mentioned renewable fuels, and there's some EPA actions that are coming that might drive some of this to keep diesel around for a little bit longer.
Indeed, and just not to pick on California again, but they one thing they have been a leader in is pushing for low carbon fuels in California. So we're now 10 plus years into their low carbon fuels program. And that result of that today is that more than 70% of the diesel fuel sold in California is in fact renewable diesel. And so that's a drop-in replacement for diesel. I think everybody probably is aware of what that is, but it's refined from a variety of different feedstocks, including soybean oil, used cooking oil, waste animal fats, a whole range of food byproducts and other waste materials. And that very neat, clean molecule of diesel fuel works perfectly in any diesel engine, vehicle, or equipment without any modifications whatsoever. And so it's a great success story that we have that in California. At the national level, we have a situation in the last few years. We have this is actually the 20th anniversary of the Renewable Fuel Standard. And if you wind back the clock on that, you remember the days when they started blending ethanol into gasoline. And that was to help address air quality issues. And it was also to support the domestic farming industry as well with producing copious quantities of corn, and ethanol became sort of a staple of our part of our gasoline mix over the last 20 years. And the biodiesel world came along within that same time frame. And we have now today, the opportunity to finally see a growth-oriented biofuel policy from the federal government. The last 4 years, the previous administration had put forward a sort of a lackluster, basically a no-growth policy with their regulation. And the Renewable Fuel Standard is a complicated thing, but basically it requires that certain volumes of renewable fuels be blended into the mainstream fuel pool and sets volumes each year that are needed to do that, and then assigns a value to those volumes. And there are tax credits involved here too for the producers, et cetera. So it's a fairly intricate system. And the last 4 years really was a stagnation time, even though there's tremendous interest, and the industry, the biofuel industry, and the petroleum refiners have recently joined in the last 4 or 5 years to convert some of their refineries that were producing highway or off-road diesel into being able to produce renewable diesel. They saw the opportunity coming for more low-carbon fuels to be used in the population. And we have tremendous investment now to bring on renewable diesel. We just didn't have the federal policy that drove the growth to get there. And now we do have that. EPA proposed that on June 13th, a very robust policy that's we were running about 3.2 billion gallons of bio-based diesel in the previous policies, and the new one is 5.6, I believe it is. So it's a considerably positive sign, a very high growth proposal that's out there. It's going to be public comment through July and through in early August that closes, and we expect some decision on that hopefully by the end of the year. But it is a very robust, big number that industry, the renewable fuel sector, is ready and able to meet, I think. But like many of these rules, the devil is in the details. And some of the things that EPA has chosen to do in this rule are ones that complicate things and may detract, I think, from being able to achieve that very high volume growth objective that they laid out. And I'll give you just one example of that, and that is how they treat imported feedstocks. So if you get feedstocks, use cooking oil, let's say, from Asia or some other country, is barged in and processed in the U.S., today, that feedstock has one value, but under the new proposal, it would have half the value that it has today. And so this is a huge problem because in order to keep the renewable fuel supply going, we rely on a whole mix of both imported and domestic feedstocks. And so in order to hit those growth volumes, we really need to have the supportive details of that policy as well. And so I think we'll see how it shakes out, but I think industry's pretty confident. We've got a good growth-oriented mindset now within EPA on renewable fuels, and that's key, I think, for trucking, because we're going to see more and more of these fuels come along. We have low-carbon fuel standards now in place in California, Oregon, Washington, New Mexico, Colorado, and now New York just considered one again for the fourth year in a row, but did not pass it. So we would expect that we'll see more of those in the future. And this, I think, is a really important solution for trucking that looks to reduce emissions, lower the carbon footprint by using the same vehicles you're using today, but just switching out the fuel. And so that is going to be, I think, a key thing for the future, but we need to get these policies right.
And it's a shame that so often the political challenges will trump the technical challenges when it comes to implementing solutions. You mentioned renewable diesel. It's chemically the exact same thing as conventional diesel. This is different than, let's say, biodiesel, where 100% neat biodiesel may have some issues with some engine systems unless there are some modifications. I think it's an important distinction to make. I guess the challenge is being able to ramp up and make enough renewable diesel to put a dent in the overall diesel consumption marketplace, right?
Indeed. I mean, that is the challenge here. And I think I want to put some round numbers on. I think we're probably, at 40 couple billion gallons of diesel fuel consumed last year. And so this is pointing us to almost 6 billion, let's say, gallons of renewable nationwide. So you can see that, we're a long ways from fully displacing the petroleum diesel that we're reliant on. But, as they say, every little bit helps. And particularly as we go forward, you start to, just like we're seeing that, an all electric vehicles may work in some fleet applications and some areas, but not in others. We might find more of a strategy going forward where we have, sort of many different fuels and technologies working in different places because either that's where the fuel is, that's where the policy is, and that means that people can build a market around that. So you could take hydrogen, for example, and say we're going to have available hydrogen on the East Coast and the Northeast. And so that would enable trucking to consider the use of hydrogen internal combustion engines or perhaps fuel cells down the road as an alternative to petroleum-based diesel in the years ahead. And you might only be able to find that within, a 1,000-mile range of a couple of fueling depots for hydrogen, but maybe that works. And the system where we, have become accustomed to, crisscrossing the country, every corner of America where you could find a diesel pump night or day, that's worked for many, many years and will continue, I'm sure, at some level. But, we may need to adjust our thinking about how we go forward in terms of, finding the right mix of fuels and technologies that can be, I don't want to say custom designed, but, fit into the policies and things in a certain area. So, it'll be an exciting time, I would think, the next decade in this industry.
Hydrogen certainly has its own challenges. It depends on how you source it. You've got your green hydrogen, your gray hydrogen. Although you don't want it coming from fracking necessarily if you're trying to get the maximum environmental benefit from it. And also, you have to have energy to compress it and or liquefy to transport it, and that has to be factored into the whole mix too. It's not like a drop-in replacement like renewable diesel. So very important to keep that in mind. A few minutes left in the program, about a minute here, minute and a half. What about natural gas? Is there a resurgence for natural gas?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, this is something that I've watched over time. We used to sort of battle the, diesel versus natural gas kind of thing. But man, that technology and that industry have really, I think, stepped up and are really blooming here at a good time. I think, a lot of that has to do with some really new and advanced engine choices. Cummins has really, set the bar high for, advanced natural gas engines. And that is being a boon for folks. So you take that and couple that up with renewable natural gas, which now is a growing portion of the whole natural gas supply. And it's hard to get any better than that in terms of carbon reduction and familiarity of fuel. So I definitely think that natural gas is having a resurgence well beyond California now. And let's just see how far we can go with it.
And it sounds like there's going to be not one solution, but many solutions. And that's probably applicable for an industry that's so diverse with all its different applications. Kind of makes sense. But one thing it sounds like, Alan, is the future of diesel looks bright. And it's going to be around for quite a while, particularly here in the commercial vehicle sector for long-haul trucking in North America. Thank you so much for joining us on the program. It was Alan Schaeffer, Executive Director of the Engine Technology Forum. We've been talking about the future of diesel, and you'll be able to listen to this broadcast asynchronously at any time at your convenience at any of the social media channels, including the main home here at RadioNemo.com. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and kick it back over to the studios and Jimmy Mack.
Always, there are people who are adjusting quite nicely to this platform, but few at the level or skill that you're doing it. Thank you so much, Robert.
Thank you. And next week, we're going to be talking about the value of recommended practices. And I'm going to be interviewing myself, unless you want to help me out with that, Jimmy Mack.
I am.
Tech Talk with TMC.
I'm happy to jump in and join you for that, Robert. I actually look very much forward to working with a genuine bona fide pro. Have the best of days, my friend.
You too. Take care.